This is an ABC News special report.
Good afternoon, I'm Terry Moran in Washington, and we're coming on the air at this hour with breaking news, a dramatic legal moment now unfolding in front of the American people. Prosecutors in New York City today unsealed a 15-count indictment against the Trump Organization, the company run for decades by the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, and against that man, CFO, Chief Financial Officer of that company, Allen Weisselberg. The Manhattan District Attorney filing tax fraud charges against the Trump Organization and Allen Weisselberg. You see him being led, he's being led in there to the court a little while ago. There he is in the blue shirt. And as he passes, you'll see that Allen Weisselberg, Trump's accountant for almost half a century, is being led into court in handcuffs, which is an unusual circumstance in a white-collar crime case. And he was indicted by a grand jury. The charges against Allen Weisselberg and the Trump Organization allege a 15-year-long tax fraud scheme to mislead state taxing authorities with off-the-book compensation for top executives. Now, it is important to note, as we show that picture, neither Donald Trump nor members of his family are being charged at this time. The indictments against the Trump Organization and against its chief financial officer, Allen Weisselberg, right there, they are the result of a 2-year investigation into the company. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office fighting all the way to the Supreme Court to obtain the former president's personal and business tax returns. The Trump Organization releasing a statement today on these charges, saying Allen Weisselberg is being used as a pawn by the district attorney to harm the former president. That's a quote there. So this is a major development in the life, not just of the Trump Organization or the former president, but also in the life of the country. Donald Trump is still very active politically, contemplating. In fact, he says he will run for president again. Tens of millions of Americans supported him in the last election. And I want to go to our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, on this indictment. Dan, we've been looking through it. What do you make of these charges? How significant are they?
Well, look, you've got charges against the Trump Organization, and then you've got charges against Allen Weisselberg individually. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two, because when you're talking about indicting a company, you're typically talking about fines and the ramifications that the company will endure. Banks won't lend them money, people will flee, et cetera. When you're talking about an individual, you're talking about possible prison time. And here, you're talking about the possibility of 5 to 15 years for Allen Weisselberg. It's what's called a Class C felony, and there's no mandatory minimum prison sentence, but these are serious charges. The question becomes, Terry, as the public looks at this, right, and as we look at the charges and we look at the amount of money involved, et cetera, the question's going to be, what is the end game here? Is the DA looking here to indict the Trump Organization and that's the end of it? Or is this really just the first move in a much longer legal chess game? And it seems to me that that's, of course, what they're doing here. They are trying to put the pressure on Allen Weisselberg by indicting him. They are putting the pressure on the Trump Organization. And I would expect that this is just the beginning of this investigation as it continues.
Just the beginning. And let me just read very briefly from the indictment itself. The New York City Manhattan District Attorney saying that the purpose of the scheme was to compensate Allen Weisselberg and other Trump Organization executives in a manner that was off the books. That is what the prosecutors are saying. They point to an apartment on Riverside Drive. They point to tuition at private school for 2 of Allen Weisselberg's children. They point to the use of a car. These are benefits, fringe benefits, meant to be declared as compensation by both the Trump Organization paying it and Allen Weisselberg receiving it. That was not done. And that's the basis for this indictment. And let me go to John Santucci, who has covered Donald Trump as long as anyone at ABC right now. And I want to ask you, John, about Allen Weisselberg. How important is Allen Weisselberg in the Trump Organization? And what does this indictment mean for him and for the former president, who you know so well?
Aaron?
Well,
Well, Terry, actually, I just spoke to former President Trump, who's reacting to this in real time. He called the charges a disgrace, said it's a continuation of the witch hunt that's been going on for some time, repeatedly said it's a shame. And I also said to him, Terry, we saw some of that footage of Allen Weisselberg and the legal team walking into court. I said, Mr. President, are you aware that they brought your CFO in handcuffs? The president was unaware of that. He actually paused for a moment while we were on the phone, Terry, looked up at cable news coverage, and said to me, John, I can't believe it. It's a disgrace, a disgrace. He's a tremendous person. And then he went on to say about Weisselberg, this is former President Trump, Terry, he says they are pressuring him, setting him up. They want him to lie against Trump. I then asked the former president, does he think that's going to happen? And Terry, his response was no. This is someone, of course, as we've been reporting, has worked for former President Trump and the Trump Organization for some time. He's been an employee there since the 1970s. Prior to that, actually working for Fred Trump, the president's father, when they had a company out in Queens and Brooklyn outside of Manhattan. But I think the biggest takeaway from this today, and the fact that Cy Vance, the Manhattan DA, is not speaking, is that this is only just beginning. We know that in addition to Weisselberg, the DA has been investigating Matt Calamari, that is the longtime head of security for the Trump Organization, and falling into a similar bucket as Weisselberg, Terry. This is a person who has been loyal. In addition to Calamari, Calamari's son also works for the Trump Organization and has had equal fringe benefits, these apartments, these cars, and the school tuition. So a lot more to figure out as this develops.
All right, John Santucci, thanks very much for that, for having spoken with former President Trump. As John just reported, he did. The former president can read the writing on the walls here. He says what the prosecutors are trying to do is use Allen Weisselberg to get to him, to get to Donald Trump. He called it a disgrace. Our reporter Aaron Katersky was inside the courtroom as this all unfolded. Aaron, take us in the courtroom and tell us what happened and its significance as you see it.
It was a rather extraordinary scene waiting in a sweltering hallway, Terry, to be led into this court. And it was quite a full well filled with prosecutors from both the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the New York State Attorney General's Office. And then on the other side, Allen Weisselberg, the Trump Organization's long-serving chief financial officer, entering in handcuffs like any common criminal. The handcuffs kept his wrists behind his back. There was a court officer on either side. They stayed right with him as they seated him down at the defense table. And the defense, Terry, really reacted negatively to the way that prosecutors portrayed these charges. This indictment, the very first to result from a 2-year investigation, alleges a scheme to defraud tax authorities here in New York City and in New York State to the tune of millions of dollars. This alleged scheme ran from 2005 to 2021, the indictment said, and Allen Weisselberg himself was able to enrich himself with $1.7 million. All along, the prosecutors have been looking through bookkeeping records, through tax records, through bank records, and they've made clear this, at this stage, is just a first strike. The investigation is ongoing. Terry?
And they are hoping to get Allen Weisselberg's cooperation on that. But the real reason we're covering this, obviously, is the former president of the United States built his reputation, in many ways came to public attention and won the 2016 election in part through his reputation as a successful tycoon businessman, The Apprentice sealing that in the eyes of millions of Americans. And I want to go to John Carl, who is writing a book, has written another book on Donald Trump and has covered him and knows him very well, about the significance here politically for our country, beyond the people involved. We'll get back to the legal case in just a second. But in this sense that this is the Trump Organization, now in the crosshairs of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and one of Donald Trump's closest business associates for decades, now in the dock.
This is the Trump Organization. This is the Trump Organization's most important employee who is not a member of the Trump family. This is, as John Santucci pointed out, somebody that has worked for the Trump Organization for almost a half a century, somebody who worked for Fred Trump, somebody who knows the ins and outs of the finances of this company better than any other person alive. So the significance here is more than a case that at its base is regarding the CFO, regarding Weisselberg, $1.7 million over 15 years. In other words, a little over $100,000 a year in compensation he didn't pay taxes for. That's not why this is generating all this attention. That is not why this has attracted the joint efforts of the Manhattan District Attorney and the Attorney General for the state of New York. This is clearly the first step, what they hope will be the first step in this case, not stopping at Allen Weisselberg. I did find something interesting in the charging document here, Terry, and that is regarding the tuition that was paid to Weisselberg's two children, the private school tuition. It says in the indictment that Weisselberg's family members were paid by personal checks drawn on the account of and signed by Donald J. Trump. And then later, the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. So in other words, it was Trump himself, out of his personal account, that was paying this compensation, this hidden compensation, in what the prosecutors are describing as a scheme to avoid taxes. So that's a reference directly to the former president. But obviously, the question here is, will the longest-serving and most important non-family member in the Trump organization, somebody who has been a Trump loyalist to both Fred Trump and Donald Trump, will that person turn? Will he flip? Will he testify against the person that he has spent virtually his entire adult life working for? That's a pretty big question. Talking to people who know Allen Weisselberg, who understand the Trump organization, say it's very hard for them to believe that Allen Weisselberg would turn on Donald Trump. That said, the world looks a little different if you're facing possible time in prison.
That's a great point, John. And to underline, this 25-page, 15-count indictment does name the Trump organization specifically as one of the defendants. And so let's go to someone who worked there. Barbara Ress is the former executive vice president of the Trump organization. She's also the author of a book, Tower of Lies, What My 18 Years of Working with Donald Trump Reveals About Him. And Barbara, thank you for being with us. So let's just get right to that question that John Carl was asking. Clearly, the prosecutors are trying to bring the hammer down on Allen Weisselberg, muscle him in order to get him to turn state's evidence against Donald Trump, the former president. What do you think the likelihood is of that?
I think that that's a possibility. I mean, actually, more than just a possibility. Allen is not the kind of guy that's going to take jail time. I mean, actually, when you think about it, who would? There's no pardons down the line. What is Trump offering him in return for going to jail for him? And the worst thing could be his children. One of his children, one of his sons, gets charged with something that could possibly have prison time. I think that he will ultimately talk. You know, I was saying he's flipping or not flipping, turning. Is there something wrong that was done that he's turning about? And I think that goes to the heart of the matter. Clearly, Allen knows everything that went on, but clearly, in my experience, nothing went on without Trump's approval and often direction. And that's the gap that they're going to bridge with Weisselberg.
And let me ask you this about loyalty. You said, what would keep him on board? Well, they've been together in this work for decades. He worked for his dad. What about loyalty? How close are they, and does that come into play?
Yeah, they're close. I'm sure they're very close. I'm sure Donald talks to Allen did talk to him every day, and probably even while he was president, talk to him all the time. But that doesn't mean that they're equals or that there's any love between them, so to speak. I'm sure that Donald castigated Allen just the way he did everybody else in the organization when I was there, and now even more so. Allen was a sycophant. He was a guy that walked with his hat in his hand. He called Donald, Mr. Trump, when all of us called him Donald. He's a true believer. And I think that some of that has to wear off when he starts realizing that he knows he did wrong and he's implicating himself. And he's going to have to try to think of a way out of it. And I do think that he'll cave at a point in time.
Well, an inside look from former executive vice president of the Trump Organization, Barbara Ress. Thanks very much. And for an analytical look at what this does for the Trump Organization, the signature operation of Donald Trump, let me go to our chief business correspondent, Rebecca Jarvis. And Rebecca, this is unusual. The corporation is being indicted along with its chief financial officer. What impact can this have? Look, we're a long way from any kind of trial. These charges at some point could be dropped, or in a trial the organization could be found not guilty. But today, what impact does this have on the Trump Organization?
Terry, it's significant. If you think about it, tax evasion, tax fraud, these are charges routinely brought against individuals. They are far less likely, far more rare, brought against corporations. And when they are brought against corporations, the company tends to be small, 50 employees or less. The issue here for the Trump Organization is that it is named in the indictment. And while the penalty may be small, it might be still too large to many of us, but millions of dollars, the collateral damage that comes as a result of an indictment like this can't be understated, because what happens is if you're an indicted company, suddenly all of your relationships are different. Your banking relationships change. Any loans outstanding can be called in. A bank can immediately say, pay up. You've broken your deal with us. What you're facing now is a different situation than when we originally lent you the money. It is not a resume builder as a corporation to be indicted, and other companies, the PR issue of doing business with a company that is charged with tax fraud, the PR issues around that, as well as the potentially legal issues of just conducting business, become more significant. So the Trump Organization going forward, which, by the way, the Trump Organization is the head, it is a collection of many LLCs beneath it, it becomes much more complicated, much less tenable for the organization to continue moving forward, especially when those debts start coming due. Finding new banking relationships, Terry, very difficult for this organization. You can't put an organization in jail, but you can really starve it of money, and that's exactly what can happen here.
And the Trump Organization does a lot of borrowing, as a lot of companies like that do. Rebecca Jarvis, thanks very much. Let's go back to Aaron Katersky, who was inside the courtroom and now has had a chance to go through the indictment. Aaron, you've been reporting on this case. What can you tell
us? I'm struck in some ways, Terry, by just how boilerplate these charges are for any kind of privately held firm that's trying to compensate employees off the books and lessen their payroll taxes. Here, according to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, this was a 15-year scheme that was orchestrated at the highest levels of the executive suite in the Trump Organization to compensate executives like Allen Weisselberg, allegedly, and others off the books so that they didn't have to pay payroll taxes. Weisselberg benefited $1.7 million is the number mentioned in the indictment, but there are other unnamed executives who are no doubt feeling the pinch. And this ran for 15 years, from 2005 to 2021, encompassing the years that former President Trump was in office.
It is an extensive indictment, maybe just the start of things. Aaron, thanks for that. Let me go back to Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst, on a question that has to be asked by all of us, really. Donald Trump is the former president of the United States, the 45th president of the United States. There aren't a lot of them. And 70+ million people voted for him in the last election. He says he's going to run again. So should prosecutors, Democratic prosecutors in a liberal state, how do they take that into account? Because they run the risk, don't they, of having their credibility undermined, as Donald Trump and his allies are certainly trying to do by saying this is just a partisan witch hunt.
Right. In theory, prosecutors are supposed to decide things strictly based on the evidence, right? Nothing else comes into consideration. But of course, the reality is that prosecutors every day have discretion in terms of what cases they're going to bring. And as Jonathan Karl and others have been talking about, when you're talking about over 15 years, this isn't a lot of money considering the amount of money that the Trump Organization was dealing in. And I think that the DA here does take a risk in the court of public opinion, meaning they would say we can defend this. They would say this was criminal. They would say this ought to be prosecuted. And yet the response is these types of cases aren't prosecuted all that often. And if that's true, should there be a higher standard for the former president of the United States? And I think that the DA is both doing what typical DAs do, which is put the heat on in the hope of turning, in the hope of moving the bigger case forward. But there's also another consideration that has to be looked at, which is what will be the response in the court of public opinion when looking at these particular charges, this particular amount of money, in terms of the big picture of Donald Trump.
And once again, thank you, Dan. Once again, we emphasize neither the former president nor any members of his family have been indicted. They aren't included in this explicitly, but it is the Trump organization that has been indicted, and that is a family business. As Dan points out, if there's a picture inside the courtroom today. That is Allen Weisselberg, Donald Trump's longtime accountant, the chief financial officer of the Trump organization, facing charges. He specifically faces charges of grand larceny in the second degree and others. And those are charges that come with a 5 to 15-year prison sentence under New York state law. And so he does face a very serious ordeal ahead. Prosecutors know that, and as we've been talking, it is undoubtedly one of their purposes. In fact, they've told reporters on background that they intend to use that leverage to try to get this man to turn state's evidence against former President Donald Trump. And let me go to John Carl on that. Everything is seen through a partisan lens these days, John, but I actually wonder if this kind of ordeal for the former president and his company, if it impacts his company, as Rebecca has suggested, very deleteriously, does that begin at all to erode the support, that rock solid, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue support that he's had with so many millions of Republicans?
I think you're going to see the reverse here, Terry. When Trump is attacked, those fervent supporters he has rally around him. When Trump went through his first impeachment, his popularity among his base did not waver at all. Again, rallied around him. From the people that would attend his rallies to his supporters in Congress. Right with him, fighting back, saying they are going after him not because he did something wrong. They're going after him because he's Donald Trump. They're going after him for political reasons. I mean, he's been using that witch hunt line. He's been using that witch hunt line since really his first months in office, as even before there was a formal special counsel investigation into Russia. Any effort to look at him, to look at his activities, is portrayed as a witch hunt. Now, that said, his entire political career is based on the perception that he is the ultimate successful business guy, that he's the one that does the big deals, that he's got his shiny tower there on Fifth Avenue, massive company, multi-billionaire, often consistently always exaggerating the degree of the success and of the wealth. But that's why people rallied around him. He was the ultimate success. So, if over the long term, as Rebecca said, this has a real negative impact on the bottom line, on that company, really hurts the viability of the Trump organization, perhaps. But in the short term, Terry, I expect that this will not hurt the support among those who would support him if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, as he memorably said in 2016. They will support him. Regardless of what a Manhattan DA, who is a Democrat, and a New York Attorney General, who is a Democrat, are accusing his company of doing right now.
Absolutely. And as you point out, thank you, John, that this was the case throughout his presidency, that he has managed to make this hardwired connection with so many millions of Americans so that when he is accused, when he is perceived to be attacked, they are too. That is a special political connection that you don't see a lot. Let me go back to Rebecca Jarvis on Allen Weisselberg and Chief Financial Officer. I've been calling him Donald Trump's accountant, but describe for people, well, what is a chief financial officer and how valuable is what he knows, potentially if he does turn state's evidence, to the prosecution?
Well, Terry, this is an incredibly valuable person if he were to turn over any kind of information as evidence, because this is the person who signs things, who goes through all of its relationships with the banks, who manages the books of the Trump organization, who crosses every T, dots every I, and knows exactly where the dollars are flowing. He has a wealth of information that he oversaw in his role as CFO inside of the Trump organization. And as many have pointed out now, he's been with the Trump organization for many years. Also, to a point that John Carl just made about Donald Trump, the former president, as a businessman. One of the issues here, if we go down this path where the Trump organization faces financial trouble, if it goes into, for example, bankruptcy, that is suddenly a moment where we crack open the books. The courts begin to take a look at the inner workings of the Trump organization. Where did the money come from? Where did the money go? Who were the lenders? Who didn't give money? Who did give money? Who's owed money by the Trump organization? And suddenly, this organization that has been able to be built privately based on the accounts of its many members suddenly becomes a much more public enterprise in bankruptcy court. So that will be key, as will the degree to which Donald Trump's personal wealth is tied to the Trump organization itself. We don't know to what degree his personal wealth is wrapped up in his corporation, in his organization. But if the organization itself goes down the path of bankruptcy, and if a large amount of Donald Trump's wealth is wrapped up in the organization, it could also spell serious financial trouble for him down the road, Terry.
Serious challenges ahead for the former president and his organization. Thank you, Rebecca. And the Trump team has just issued a legal statement. I'll read just a part of it. They say that the case brought by the New York District Attorney's Office is unprecedented. We are unaware of any case brought by that office concerning employee compensation. We cannot find a case brought by the IRS in such a way. And then they go on to say, in our view, this case was brought because the company's name is Trump. This is not appropriate, and it is unjustified, and it crosses a line never before crossed in this country's 244 history, as this case signals that it is now open season for local prosecutors to target federal political opponents and adversaries. That is the statement of the Trump legal team. And let me go back to Dan Abrams on that. Dan, this is just what we were talking about, the risk in pursuing this kind of case, even if that's where the facts lead, that it becomes mired in our ferocious and destructive partisan politics.
Right. And be careful in listening to that statement as they parse through the specific areas that they're saying are unprecedented, right? It is not unprecedented for a corporation or a company to be charged with the very crime we're talking about here. I recall in 2012, there was a big law firm named Dewey Ballantine at the time that was accused of this very crime. And some of the people who worked there were accused of this very crime, alleging that the company had defrauded, stole from the firm's lenders, investors, and others. So it's not that this particular crime has never been used, applying it to a company. The question is, as the Trump team is laying out, in this particular fact pattern, when you're talking about what are effectively, perks, probably goes a little beyond perks, but if you want to view it in its most pejorative way, perks, not paying taxes on that. So this is exactly the sort of argument you're going to see in the court of public opinion. But inside the courtroom, you're going to see different arguments, right? You're not going to be able to just make the political arguments. Well, they shouldn't have prosecuted it. They never would have. They're going to have to respond on the facts. They're going to have to respond to the documents. They're going to have to respond on the question of intent. Did he know? What did the company know? What was their intent in doing this? So watch for that. Out of court versus in court, I think you're going to hear different kinds of arguments.
All right, Dan, we look ahead to how this case will get resolved. But let's also look ahead with Aaron Katersky, who's been covering this investigation and this case. Once again, we are hearing from prosecutors that today's indictment they believe is a first step, a first strike, I believe you called it, in what is a continuing investigation. So where do things go from here?
I'm struck, Terry, by almost as much by what's not in the indictment as what is. This indictment alleges a 15-year tax scheme. It runs 25 pages. There are 15 separate criminal charges that the Trump Organization and Allen Weisselberg pleaded not guilty to. But what's not in the indictment? Anything about hush payments to Stormy Daniels or other women who have accused Donald Trump of long-denied affairs. There's nothing about property valuations, how Donald Trump valued his holdings when he was talking to banks to obtain loans and when he was talking to tax authorities to pay taxes. We know those are the elements that piqued Cy Vance's interest in the first place. So there's a lot more for these investigators to dig into and potentially more charges coming. The New York Attorney General's office has a separate inquiry into property valuations, especially a Trump property in Westchester County, north of New York City. And the D.C. District Attorney has been looking for a long time at all the money raised for former President Trump's inauguration. Taken together, Donald Trump's legal troubles, despite what he says about these particular charges, are not over.
The investigations continue, and Aaron Katersky, I know you'll be reporting on them for us. Thanks very much. So just to wrap up once again, in Manhattan, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office unsealed indictments against the Trump Organization, the company, and Allen Weisselberg, who is that organization's chief financial officer and a very close associate of former President Donald Trump. The former president is not charged. Neither are members of his family. But this 15-count indictment alleges a scheme to defraud tax authorities in New York by paying compensation and keeping it off the books, essentially fringe benefits, an apartment, school tuition, and things like that. Allen Weisselberg appeared in court. He was led into court in handcuffs. He pleaded not guilty, as did the Trump Organization. The investigation continues. We'll have much more on this on ABC News Live and on World News Tonight with David Muir coming up this evening. I'm Terry Moran. Thanks for being with us.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.